When I walked into the kitchen that morning, I didn't expect anything to be different. The same pale light from the window, the same soft hum of the refrigerator, the same familiar mug I always used. But when I turned the corner, I saw him standing there, shirtless, his back to me, pouring coffee like he belonged in that space. My breath caught, not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt. A strange heaviness spread across my chest, an awareness I wasn't prepared for. I froze, unsure whether to say something or walk away quietly. Before I could decide, he turned. He smiled, simple, polite, and said, "Good morning." I nodded, my voice stuck somewhere between my throat and my conscience. The way his eyes paused on me, just for a moment too long, sent a flicker down my spine. I was too old for flickers. Married for decades. Safe. Or so I thought. That moment, quiet, harmless on the surface, was where everything began to shift. He wasn't supposed to live with us for long. Just a few weeks, my husband had said. A favor. Family. But that day, I felt something realign deep inside, like a door I'd locked years ago creaked open. And I knew, even if I wanted to ignore it, that this wasn't going to end simply. Something had begun. And before I take you through everything that happened, everything I regret and everything I don't, let me ask you this: have you ever felt something awaken inside you after years of silence? If you have, write where you're watching from in the comments below. Because 3 months ago, I made a choice that I never thought I'd make, and I need you to know why. It started quietly. Almost invisibly. My husband had told me his grandson would be moving in for a while. Just a few months, he said, tapping on his phone, already distracted by something else. I'd nodded, as I always did. I didn't ask questions anymore. We'd grown into that kind of marriage, the quiet type. Comfortable, but not comforting. I didn't know much about his grandson, only that he was 23, studying architecture, and needed a place to stay while finishing his final semester. He arrived one Sunday afternoon with a single duffel bag and a worn leather sketchbook under his arm. I watched him step through the doorway, tall and calm, not a trace of teenage arrogance in his demeanor. My husband greeted him with a proud smile, clapping him on the back. "She runs the house," he said, gesturing toward me. "Listen to her." I smiled and offered my hand. His grip was warm, firm, respectful. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said, his voice lower than I expected. It was a simple exchange, but something about it stayed with me longer than it should have. He settled in quickly, occupying the guest room at the end of the hallway. I didn't think much of him at first. I was more focused on laundry schedules, grocery lists, rearranging the living room because the couch had been leaving imprints in the carpet. The usual distractions. But within a few days, I began to notice things. He always woke up early, earlier than I did, and made coffee before I came downstairs. At first, I thought it was just polite. Then I realized he was timing it. Every morning, I'd walk into the kitchen and find the exact same scene, him at the counter, the smell of coffee in the air, 2 mugs on the table. "I wasn't sure if you'd want some," he'd say. I always said yes. At night, he'd be in the living room, sketching quietly while my husband watched the news with the volume too high. I'd pretend to read a book, but I'd feel his presence across the room, like a low vibration I couldn't turn off. He never stared. He was never inappropriate. And maybe that's what made it worse. It wasn't long before I caught myself watching him. Not in a way I could admit. Just glances, the way his fingers moved across paper, the way his brow furrowed when he focused, the way he always cleared his throat before speaking. Little things. But they gathered like dust, and I was choking on them before I realized how thick the air had become. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room. My husband had gone out for errands, and I didn't hear him come down the stairs. I looked up, startled, as he entered the room, holding a book he'd borrowed from the shelf. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said. He smiled. I smiled back. But my hands were shaking slightly as I folded the last towel. I told myself it was the silence of the house, the pressure of managing everything alone. But that night, as I laid next to my husband, who turned his back and fell asleep in minutes, I stared at the ceiling and wondered why I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. A week passed. Then another. The rhythm of the house adjusted, and his presence became part of the daily pattern. But my internal rhythm had changed. I felt it most during the small things. The way I chose my outfits with more attention, brushed my hair a little longer, reapplied lipstick before dinner, for no one, I told myself. Just habit. Then came the garden. One afternoon, I asked him to help me bring in the patio chairs before a storm rolled in. We worked side by side, barely speaking. At one point, we reached for the same cushion. Our fingers touched. Not dramatically. Not deliberately. But something sparked under my skin like static electricity. I pulled my hand back. He did the same. But we both paused. That pause held more weight than I could explain. That evening, I stood in the mirror longer than usual. I examined the lines around my mouth, the soft sag beneath my chin. I adjusted my blouse 3 times before finally buttoning it all the way up. Then unbuttoning the top one again. I didn't know what I was doing. My husband didn't notice anything, not the blouse, not my silence, not my tension. He was busy texting someone about golf. The turning point, though subtle, happened the next morning. I had gone to the kitchen early, hoping to have the space to myself. But he was already there, facing the window, sipping coffee. "You're up early," I said. He turned, smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep." "Me neither." He hesitated before asking, "Do you ever miss the noise?" I wasn't sure what he meant. "What noise?" "You know, life. When it used to be louder." I stood there, holding the counter, and realized I hadn't heard life in years. That night, I lay in bed again, staring at the ceiling. My husband beside me, his breathing deep and even. I turned my head toward the window. A soft wind rustled the trees. Somewhere down the hall, I imagined him awake, sitting with his sketchbook, thinking his quiet thoughts. And I knew. Something inside me had shifted, and there was no going back. The morning after that strange moment in the kitchen, I tried to act like everything was normal. I moved through the house with practiced efficiency, wiping down the counters, refolding the towels in the guest bathroom, rearranging the books on the coffee table. It was a ritual I used when something felt off inside me. My husband had left for the day, already buried in meetings before the sun rose. I was alone with the silence, and him. He hadn't come down yet. Part of me hoped he wouldn't. Another part, the part one was trying to ignore, listened for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. I didn't have to wait long. The moment he entered the room, I felt the tension return, coiling itself just beneath my ribs. He looked casual, sweatshirt, hair slightly damp from the shower. He said good morning, and I nodded, trying not to let my eyes linger on him. We moved around the kitchen like dancers in a quiet duet. He reached for a plate, I moved aside. I stepped toward the fridge, he waited. There was nothing overt. No words beyond the ordinary. But every shared glance felt heavier than it should have. Every second of silence rang louder than any conversation. After breakfast, I retreated to the garden, hoping that fresh air might clear my thoughts. I pruned the roses, swept the patio, rearranged the flower pots twice. It didn't help. I kept replaying the previous day, wondering if I'd misread everything. Maybe it was all in my head. I was older. I was married. Maybe I was just lonely. He stepped outside later, holding a glass of water. We talked about the weather. It was dull, harmless. But then there was a pause. He looked at me in a way I didn't know how to interpret, like he saw something in me I had long forgotten was there. I excused myself quickly and went back inside. My heart was racing. I hadn't felt that way in years. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection, trying to steady my breath. It wasn't fear exactly. It was awareness. And it was growing stronger. Later that evening, after dinner, my husband retreated to his study, as he often did. I was in the living room with a book, though I wasn't reading. He entered quietly, sat on the opposite side of the room, and opened his laptop. The soft tapping of keys filled the space. I could feel him glancing at me from time to time, though I never looked up to confirm. The tension built with every passing minute. I wanted to get up and leave, to put distance between us. But I stayed. Around 10, I closed my book and said I was going to make tea. He stood up, too. "I'll help." In the kitchen, under the soft overhead light, we moved again in silence. He passed me the sugar, I handed him a mug. As he reached across me to grab a spoon, our hands brushed. I pulled back quickly, but his eyes caught mine before I could look away. We stood there, still, neither of us speaking. And then we kissed. It happened in a moment. No hesitation. No words. Just the closing of space and the collision of something that had been growing in silence for days. It was brief. Gentle. But undeniable. The moment it ended, I stepped back. I couldn't breathe. I turned away and left the kitchen without a word, my legs shaky beneath me. I went straight to my room and locked the door. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. They felt foreign, like I didn't trust them anymore. The house was quiet again. He didn't follow. He didn't knock. And for that, I was grateful. I laid down and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced with questions I didn't know how to answer. What had just happened? What did it mean? Was this the beginning of something I couldn't stop, or just a mistake that could be erased in the light of morning? My husband was still in his study. I could hear the hum of his voice through the door as he finished one of his endless video calls. Oblivious. Safe in his routine. Unaware that something fundamental had shifted just down the hall. I wrapped myself in a blanket and tried to disappear inside the fabric, as though it could shield me from what I had done. From what I had felt. But no matter how tightly I curled, the truth clung to me like static. When I finally drifted into sleep, it was shallow and restless. My dreams were fragmented, glimpses of gardens, half-heard voices, the weight of eyes watching me in the dark. I woke before dawn, throat dry, heart thudding. I got out of bed, washed my face, and stood at the window. The world outside was still, painted in cold shades of blue. I stayed there for a long time, unmoving. Eventually, I made my way downstairs. The kitchen was empty. No sound. No coffee brewing. I stood in the doorway, staring at the space where everything had shifted the night before. I wasn't sure what to feel. Shame? Excitement? Regret? I sat at the table and waited for the morning to catch up to me. I tried to go through the next morning as if nothing had happened. I moved around the kitchen mechanically, wiping the already clean countertop, adjusting the fruit bowl unnecessarily, checking the oven that hadn't been used. There was a strange tightness in my chest, like my body was trying to suppress everything my mind refused to process. He didn't come down right away, and I felt equal parts relief and disappointment. I wasn't ready to face him. I wasn't even ready to face myself. The previous night replayed over and over in my head like a looped recording. The stillness. The contact. The warmth of his mouth. The jarring aftermath. My husband left for the day without noticing anything different. He kissed me on the forehead, muttered something about a client meeting, and was gone. I stood at the door longer than usual after it closed, feeling the absence of his attention more than the absence of his body. By the time the grandson finally entered the kitchen, I had already made tea and was pretending to read at the table. I didn't look up immediately. I couldn't. I sensed him hesitate at the doorway. "Good morning," he said quietly. I nodded. "Morning." That was all. Nothing more. And yet the silence that followed was louder than any conversation we could have had. He moved around the kitchen in slow, careful steps, and I kept my eyes on the page, even though I hadn't registered a single word in the last 20 minutes. I needed to do something, anything, to break the weight pressing down on my chest. I decided I would go into town. Groceries, I told myself. Errands. Any reason to leave the house. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and my shopping list that was mostly empty. "I'll be back later," I said, not looking at him. He nodded, stepping aside to let me pass. I felt his eyes follow me as I walked through the door. Outside, the air was cooler than expected. I walked briskly, trying to shake the sensation from my skin. The streets were mostly quiet, a few people milling about, cars moving slowly along the road. I ducked into a nearby cafe I hadn't visited in years. It was the kind of place I used to frequent before life had become so domesticated, so quiet. I ordered tea and sat by the window, trying to pretend I was someone else. Someone lighter. Someone unburdened. But the weight of everything followed me. I stared out at the passers-by, watching strangers live lives I imagined were simpler. When the waitress brought my drink, she smiled and said, "Lovely day, isn't it?" I nodded and returned the smile, but I didn't answer. Words felt too heavy. Afterward, I stopped at the market. I walked through the aisles slowly, picking up items I didn't really need: fresh herbs, a block of cheese, a jar of imported jam. I held each one longer than necessary, using them as excuses to stall. I wasn't in a rush to go home. Eventually, I knew I had to return. The sun was already starting its descent. I walked slowly back, carrying 2 bags that felt heavier than they should have. Inside, the house was quiet again. I placed the groceries on the counter, one by one, organizing them meticulously. I could hear faint footsteps upstairs, the creak of a door. Still, we didn't speak. Dinner was quiet. My husband returned late, ate quickly, and disappeared into his office. I couldn't decide if I was grateful or insulted by his indifference. I washed the dishes with too much force, letting the water run longer than necessary, scrubbing the plates until my hands stung from the soap. Behind me, I sensed movement. I turned and saw him in the doorway again, leaning slightly against the frame, holding a book. "Do you need anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "Just looking for something to read." He glanced toward the shelf in the corner, walked over, and scanned the titles. I watched his fingers hover over the spines before selecting one and walking out again without another word. It was nothing. A simple exchange. But my heart pounded. That night, I couldn't sleep. I turned from one side to the other, sheets twisting around my legs, mind racing. My husband was asleep beside me, mouth slightly open, snoring faintly. I slipped out of bed and padded barefoot down the hallway. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't lie there any longer. I ended up in the living room, wrapping myself in a throw blanket and curling into the corner of the sofa. I stared at the dark window, watching my own reflection move with every flicker of the lamp. After some time, I heard soft footsteps. I didn't move. He entered the room quietly, unsure of whether to say anything. "I couldn't sleep," I said before he could speak. "Me neither." He sat in the armchair across from me. The silence between us stretched, but it wasn't heavy like before. It was softer. Sadder, somehow. We didn't say anything else. Just sat there, in the dim light, with everything unspoken resting between us. Eventually, I stood. "Good night," I said. "Good night." I walked back to my room, past the study, past the silence, past the weight of everything I had become. I didn't sleep, but I didn't cry either. The next morning, I watched him from the upstairs window as he walked out to the garden. He stood near the fence, hands in his pockets, head tilted slightly up toward the sky. I wanted to say something. Anything. But all I could do was watch. The feelings were there. Real. Present. But I had no idea what to do with them. So I closed the curtain and stepped away from the window, trying to breathe like I used to, before everything had changed. It was easier to pretend during the day. The rhythm of life gave me something to hide behind, meals to prepare, towels to fold, a husband who needed clean shirts and quiet dinners. But at night, when the house settled into stillness, everything I'd been holding down began to stir again. A few days had passed since that moment in the kitchen. We hadn't spoken of it, hadn't acknowledged it in any way. And yet, it lingered. Every glance felt heavier. Every movement carried a hesitation that hadn't been there before. We were cautious, careful, as if the air itself had become fragile and could shatter if we stepped too loudly. My husband remained oblivious, lost in his usual routines. His work absorbed him fully, and when he was home, he moved through the house like a man moving through fog, present but unreachable. He hadn't touched me in weeks, maybe months. I couldn't remember. One afternoon, I received a message from an old friend inviting me to spend the weekend at her country house. She said it would do me good, fresh air, wine, long walks. I told her I'd think about it, but even as I typed the reply, I knew I wouldn't go. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, listening to the distant hum of the dishwasher and the occasional creak of the wooden floors upstairs. The television was off. I didn't want noise. I wanted stillness, but the kind that calms, not the kind that accuses. Eventually, he came down, walking softly, as if already expecting to be met with tension. He moved toward the bookshelf and pulled down a volume I hadn't touched in years. He flipped through it idly, standing in the warm pool of light from the floor lamp. "I always liked this one," he said quietly, almost to himself. I looked up, unsure whether to respond. He wasn't asking for conversation. It felt more like a test of whether I could hear him, really hear him. He sat down in the chair opposite me. Not too close, not too far. We didn't look at each other, not directly. But I was aware of every shift in his posture, every time he turned a page. I felt him, and I hated that I felt anything at all. Later, when I went upstairs, I found myself pausing in front of his door. It was ajar. Light spilled out into the hallway. I heard the quiet scratch of a pencil on paper, his sketches again. I stood there for a moment, then walked away, down the hall, into the room I shared with a man who hadn't truly seen me in years. The next day, I went to the market alone. I wandered through the stalls longer than I needed to, touching fruit I didn't buy, nodding politely to people I didn't really see. The sun was warm on my face, but I felt cold. When I returned, he was outside in the garden, kneeling in the soil, pulling weeds from between the lavender bushes. He looked up as I approached, brushing his hands against his jeans. "Did you get everything?" he asked. "More than I needed," I replied. He smiled faintly. That tends to happen. I turned away before the conversation could deepen. I wasn't ready. I didn't know what I was ready for. That night, the power flickered just after sunset. A storm was rolling in. I lit candles in the kitchen, watching the wax slowly melt down the glass. The wind rattled the windows, and thunder rumbled low in the distance. We ate dinner by candlelight, the three of us. My husband complained about the outage, grumbled about the lack of television. I watched him, this man I'd shared decades with, and tried to remember the last time we'd laughed together. Not chuckled. Laughed. I couldn't. He went to bed early, muttering something about an early call. I stayed downstairs, staring at the candle, lost in the dance of its flame. He came in quietly, sitting across from me again. He didn't speak, and neither did I. We just sat, letting the storm fill the silence. At one point, I said, I should go to bed. He nodded. Okay. But I didn't move right away. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and in that space, there was something like grief. Not for what had happened, but for what couldn't. I stood eventually, walked to the base of the stairs, and turned back just once. He hadn't moved. The next morning, my husband announced he'd be away for 3 days, another client visit, another hotel, another schedule of meetings and calls. I said nothing. I packed his bag, ironed his shirts, smiled at the appropriate moments. When he left, I stood at the door again, holding the silence like a fragile thing in my hands. The house was quieter without him, but not in the same way. This quiet wasn't numb. It was charged. In the kitchen, he poured coffee, offering me a cup before I could ask. Our fingers touched when I took it. Just barely. But enough. We sat across from each other, sipping slowly, not speaking. Words had become too dangerous. Too revealing. Later, I worked in the garden while he washed the car. We moved in parallel, two lives orbiting the same center but never colliding. That evening, I took out an old photo album. One of those thick, leather-bound books with yellowing pages and glossy pictures stuck beneath plastic. I looked at a photo of myself from 20 years ago. I was laughing, holding a glass of wine, standing on the deck of some vacation house I barely remembered. My hair was longer then. My eyes clearer. I traced the edge of the photo with my fingertip. He walked into the room, looked at the album. "Is that you?" I nodded. "You look happy." I was. He sat beside me on the floor, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. We flipped through the pages in silence, one after another. Years passed beneath our hands. When we reached the last page, he closed the book gently. Neither of us said anything. We sat there for a long time. Eventually, I stood and returned the album to the shelf. My hands trembled slightly. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I stood by the window, watching the garden disappear into the darkness. And I wondered how much longer I could live this way, hovering in a space between what I felt and what I was allowed to feel. I heard a door open down the hall. Then close. And I knew I wasn't the only one awake. The rain began in the early morning, steady, quiet, not yet a storm, but enough to dim the sky and mute the colors outside the window. I watched it fall while standing barefoot in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a warm mug I hadn't even sipped from. The house felt suspended, like everything inside it was holding its breath. He entered the room a few minutes later, damp curls pushed back from his forehead, sweatshirt hanging loosely from his frame. Our eyes met for a second too long, and he hesitated in the doorway. I gestured toward the coffee pot and stepped aside. Words weren't necessary anymore. We were far past that. We moved around the kitchen in silence. Me at the stove, him at the counter, our backs to one another, and yet every movement synced like we were dancing to the same rhythm. I made breakfast without intention, scrambled eggs, toast I burned slightly, slices of fruit I cut too thin. I wasn't hungry, but it gave my hands something to do. He sat at the table, flipping through a book he'd brought down, one I recognized from the guest room shelf. I didn't ask what he was reading. I didn't need to. The atmosphere between us was different. Not heavy like before. Not awkward. It was quieter, somehow gentler. But it still carried weight. The morning passed without event. He left to run an errand, something about returning a library book. My husband had called earlier, saying he'd be staying one more night due to delays. I'd barely acknowledged it, offering only a vague okay before hanging up. He didn't notice my disinterest. Or he pretended not to. I spent the afternoon reorganizing drawers that didn't need reorganizing. I moved kitchen towels from one shelf to another, threw out spice jars that were still good, refolded napkins and tablecloths. I didn't stop moving. Stillness meant thinking, and thinking was dangerous. By early evening, I was exhausted from doing nothing. I sat on the sofa with a blanket draped over my lap, staring at the darkening sky through the window. The air smelled like rain-soaked soil. He returned quietly, shaking water from his jacket before hanging it by the door. He glanced at me but didn't speak. He didn't need to. We ate dinner in silence again, though this time it didn't feel strained. Just peaceful. We weren't pretending that nothing had happened, we were simply allowing space for what couldn't be spoken. After the dishes were done, I remained at the sink, watching the last traces of daylight disappear beyond the horizon. He stood in the doorway, lingering. I turned to face him, wiping my hands on a dish towel. There was nothing left to say, and yet everything was still unsaid. That's when it happened. We kissed. No warning, no ceremony. Just a moment, one that had been building for days. Weeks, maybe. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was slow. Deliberate. And when it ended, I stepped back, not in fear, but in recognition. This wasn't just a line crossed. It was a gate opened. I left the kitchen without speaking. He didn't follow. I was grateful for that. I needed to be alone with what I'd just allowed to happen. I went upstairs and sat at the edge of the bed, fingers pressed to my lips, not in shock, but to hold on to the sensation a little longer. I was trembling. But I wasn't scared. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that hums in your bones. I took a shower. Long hot. Letting the water run over my skin until it turned pink. I didn't scrub hard. I wasn't trying to wash anything away. I just needed to feel the ground again. Afterward, I changed into an old nightgown, one I hadn't worn in years, not because it wasn't comfortable, but because I'd stopped caring what I wore to bed. That night, I cared. I lay down and stared at the ceiling. My thoughts weren't racing anymore. They were focused. Still. I knew exactly what had happened. I knew it wasn't just a slip, not just a reaction to neglect or boredom. It was something deeper. More dangerous. At some point, I got up and moved to the window. The rain had returned, tapping gently against the glass. The garden shimmered with puddles reflecting the yellow light from the back porch. I saw his shadow pass by, a quiet movement near the fence. I stayed hidden behind the curtain, watching without watching. He didn't look up. Back in bed, I pulled the covers around me and let my mind drift. Not into fantasy, but into reality. What now? What next? How far had I already gone? I thought about my husband, his voice, his habits, his absence even in presence. I didn't hate him. That was the strangest part. I didn't even resent him. He had just faded. We both had. Slowly. Like a photograph left in the sun too long. But now, there was color again. Texture. Weight. And with that came guilt. Not sharp or immediate, but low and constant. A hum beneath the skin. I didn't cry. I didn't regret. But I didn't celebrate either. I just existed in that moment, aware of everything I had become. At some point, I drifted into sleep. It wasn't restful, but it was deep enough to carry me through the night. When I woke, the pillow was damp, not from tears, but from heat. My body still remembered what had happened. And for the first time in a long time, so did my heart. I woke before the sun, the room still cloaked in that gray-blue quiet that exists just before the day begins. My eyes opened to the ceiling, my body slow to move, but my thoughts were already alive and circling. I could still feel the residue of the previous night in my chest, an echo of something irreversible. It wasn't just about the kiss. It hadn't been, not for a long time. It was about everything else, the silence, the tension, the long stares and the absence of any other meaningful connection in my life. My husband called while I was making coffee. He asked if I needed anything from the airport when he returned that evening. I told him no, and he said he'd be home around 7. That was it. No questions. No hesitation in his voice. He sounded the same as always, though flat, courteous, mildly distracted. I stayed in the kitchen long after I'd finished my cup, hands curled around the empty mug. The silence in the house felt loaded now. Every step I took echoed louder than it should. Every drawer I opened seemed to creak with accusation. He came down later than usual, fully dressed, hair still damp from the shower. His face was unreadable, careful. He moved slower, more deliberately, as if each movement needed to be weighed before acted upon. I didn't say anything at first. I couldn't trust my voice not to betray the way my stomach flipped just from seeing him. We made breakfast together. He peeled fruit while I scrambled eggs. Neither of us spoke about the night before. Neither of us dared to break the balance we had managed to construct since then. He placed a plate in front of me, then one at his side, and we sat. The clink of the fork against the ceramic was the only sound in the room. Around noon, I found myself in the hallway outside his room, pausing. His door was open slightly, the faint sound of pages turning drifting into the hall. I didn't go in. I didn't even knock. I just stood there long enough to remind myself how dangerous it had become to linger in spaces where feelings had started to take root. Instead, I left the house. I didn't tell him where I was going, and I didn't take the car. I walked, letting the rhythm of my feet distract me from the thrum of anxiety inside my chest. The clouds above were still gray from the night's rain, but no drops fell. Just a heavy sky and damp sidewalks. I ended up at a small antique shop on the edge of town. The place smelled like old books and cedar, and the quiet inside was a relief. I ran my fingers along the spines of dusty novels and stopped in front of a glass case filled with brooches and pocket watches. I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to be somewhere I didn't have to think. When I returned home, the house was quiet again. He wasn't in the kitchen or the living room. I found him later on the back patio, sitting with his sketchpad, pencil moving in quick, sure strokes. I stood behind him for a moment, unsure if I should say anything. But he noticed me before I could decide. He closed the book slowly, not hiding what he'd been drawing, but not offering it either. "I didn't expect you back so soon," he said. "I wasn't gone long." He nodded, as if that explained everything. We stood there in a silence that didn't ask for explanation. Later, we went about our separate tasks. I reorganized shelves that didn't need attention. He swept leaves from the patio that would return with the wind by morning. We kept busy in ways that meant nothing. It was easier than confronting what had begun between us. Around 6, I began preparing dinner. A roast, something simple. I needed to cook, to focus, to distract myself. He hovered nearby, helping without offering. Passing ingredients, wiping down counters. Moving around me in ways that made my skin feel too tight. At 6:48, the front door opened. My husband was home. He called out as he stepped inside, announcing his return as if we hadn't noticed the difference his absence had made. I heard the drop of his keys, the thud of his shoes against the wall. I turned to face him with a practiced smile already in place. He kissed my cheek, commented on the smell of dinner, and then started talking about flight delays and the terrible coffee at the airport. He didn't notice the way my hands trembled slightly when I stirred the sauce. Or maybe he did and decided not to ask. Dinner that night was quiet but not unusual. He talked, mostly to himself. I nodded. The grandson remained silent for the most part, only speaking when spoken to, eyes downcast, hands calm. The tension in the room was thick enough to press into. Afterward, my husband excused himself to the study, citing emails and a conference call. The moment he left the room, I felt the air shift again. Not in danger, just in density. I began washing the dishes, slowly, methodically. The water was hot, the sponge rough against my fingers. He stood at the kitchen table, pretending to read a magazine. I knew he wasn't absorbing a word. Eventually, I turned off the water. My hands lingered on the edge of the sink. He spoke softly. "Is everything okay?" I didn't turn around. "No. But it has to be." Neither of us moved. We stood like that for a while, surrounded by the clinking of the wind chimes outside the open window and the faint creak of the floorboards above us. When I finally turned to look at him, there was nothing in his expression I hadn't already seen in myself. Regret. Want. Confusion. But there was also something else, something quieter. A kind of acceptance. I nodded once, just slightly. Then left the room. That night, I went to bed early. My husband didn't follow. I lay under the blanket, eyes open to the ceiling, feeling the weight of my choices settle deeper into my skin. There was no undoing what had already been done. But there was still the question of what came next. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to know the answer. The morning came with an odd weight to it. A sky washed in dull blue, no birdsong, no breeze, just the kind of hush that made everything feel temporary. I sat up in bed before the alarm sounded, feeling the strange clarity that comes after a night of little sleep. I hadn't dreamed. Or if I had, I didn't remember any of it. Only a kind of slow-burning ache rested behind my sternum, something between longing and regret. My husband had already gone. I'd heard him moving around before dawn, the sound of his suitcase wheels brushing over the hallway rug, the creak of the front door, and then nothing. Just the return of that familiar silence. He'd left a note on the kitchen table, back Wednesday. "Take care of yourself." I stared at it longer than I needed to, fingers tracing the indentation of his handwriting in the paper. He hadn't written "I love you." He hadn't in years. I moved through the rest of the morning with a kind of slow precision. Dishes. Laundry. I wiped down the kitchen counters twice. The second time was unnecessary, but I needed to do something with my hands. Every corner of the house felt more exposed without my husband's presence, even the air felt thinner. By the time I made it to the garden, the sun had finally broken through, casting long, warm light across the grass. He was already out there, pulling weeds near the lavender, wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, the knees stained with dirt. I watched from the doorway for a few moments, unsure whether to go to him or to wait until he saw me. But he turned his head, as if sensing me, and gave the slightest nod. I stepped outside. We didn't speak. There was no need. I knelt beside him, brushing my fingers through the earth, tugging at the stubborn roots of old, dry plants. It was something to focus on, tactile, grounding. Still, I could feel him beside me in the same way you feel a strong gust of wind before it arrives. It wasn't physical contact. It didn't need to be. At some point, I sat back on my heels, brushing my palms clean on my thighs, and looked up at the house. It seemed smaller from the garden. Almost manageable. But inside its walls were all the things I couldn't undo. All the choices I hadn't made yet. All the ones I already had. "I'm going to the store," I said later that afternoon. He offered to drive. I almost refused, but the idea of sitting in silence beside him felt more bearable than being alone in my thoughts. The drive was short and uneventful. We didn't talk, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just quiet. When we parked in front of the market, I sat still for a moment, staring through the windshield. He turned to me, hands still resting on the steering wheel. "You don't have to be afraid of what this is," he said. I didn't reply. I opened the door, stepped out, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, everything felt overly bright. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. People moved around me like I wasn't there. I moved slowly, taking more time than necessary to pick up the few items I needed: milk, fruit, bread. I didn't look back to see if he was following, but I felt his presence somewhere behind me. At the register, we stood side by side. Our hands never touched, our eyes never met. But our breath moved in sync. We returned home in silence. He helped me put the groceries away without being asked. He always did. That small, quiet attentiveness, so different from what I was used to, kept catching me off guard. Later that night, after dinner, I sat on the couch with a glass of water in hand. My husband was gone. The grandson was in the other room. The weight of the empty house was both a relief and a threat. I went upstairs to my room, stood in front of the mirror, and unpinned my hair. The strands fell around my shoulders, silver in places, softer than I remembered. I barely recognized myself. Not because I had aged, but because I'd started to feel again. When I opened the door to the hallway, I heard his footsteps. Not coming toward me. Just moving. A presence. A decision. I didn't hesitate. I walked down the hall, turned left, and stopped in front of his door. I knocked once. He opened it. Said nothing. I stepped inside. We spent the night together. Not a word was spoken. And yet, everything had been said. The next morning, I left his room quietly, just after dawn. The house was still. No voices, no movement, only the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet. I paused at the top of the stairs, hand on the banister, breathing in the weight of what we had done. I didn't feel shame. I didn't feel joy either. Just gravity. Downstairs, I made coffee. The same way I always did. Measured scoops. Water to the right line. Mug warmed first. Movements rehearsed and practiced, but that morning they felt different. Not routine, intentional. He entered the kitchen a few minutes later. His hair was still tousled from sleep, his expression quiet. We didn't touch. We didn't greet. We just stood there, both of us holding something we couldn't name. I placed a mug in front of him. He accepted it without a word. And in that silence, something between us settled. Not peace. Not finality. Just acknowledgement. Whatever came next, we had already crossed the line. And there was no returning to where we'd started. The days that followed passed with a strange stillness, as if the world itself had agreed to remain silent about what had happened. My husband returned from his trip late in the evening, carrying the same worn expression he always wore after travel, tired, preoccupied, already half in his next meeting before he even stepped through the door. I greeted him with the same measured affection, the same gentle smile I had practiced for years. He kissed my cheek, asked about the house, about dinner, about errands. I answered each question with just enough detail to satisfy his rhythm of conversation. It felt almost cruel, how easy it was to perform normalcy. Later, he unpacked in the bedroom while I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair with mechanical repetition. I could see him behind me in the reflection, folded over his suitcase, organizing socks and shirts like puzzle pieces. We hadn't shared a bed in days. Weeks, even. It was never discussed, only accepted. That night, we slept side by side. His back was to me, his breathing deep and regular. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the scent of someone else still faint on my skin, hidden beneath layers of soap and silence. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I just breathed, slowly, evenly, and waited for morning. The next day unfolded like most others. He went to work, and I was left alone with the walls that now felt like witnesses. He stayed upstairs for most of the day. I didn't seek him out, and he didn't come to me. We weren't avoiding each other, we were avoiding the tension that filled the space between us like fog. I baked a pie I hadn't made in years. Not because anyone asked for it, but because I needed the distraction of flour and sugar and time. My hands moved with purpose while my mind remained suspended. That evening, we all sat at the table. The three of us. My husband read from his phone between bites. I passed the bread. He remained quiet, barely touching his food. I caught his eyes once. Just once. A glance held for too long. My husband didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to say anything. After dinner, my husband returned to his study, closing the door behind him. That sound, solid, final, let me breathe again. I washed the dishes slowly, watching the water swirl down the drain. He came into the kitchen while I dried the last plate. He didn't speak. I didn't either. I handed him the dish towel. He took it. Our fingers brushed. Just that. Nothing more. I left the room without another word. Upstairs, I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I was no longer questioning whether I had made a mistake. That part had passed. Now I was left with something quieter. A kind of numbness that crept into my chest when I wasn't looking. The next morning, I found myself staring at his coffee cup beside mine. The placement of it, the way he always poured it for me without asking, it had become so familiar that I hadn't realized how much I'd come to expect it. He entered the kitchen a few minutes later. We stood in silence, the smell of coffee warming the room between us. Then, as if the words had been waiting for the right moment, I said, "He's suspicious." His hand paused mid-reach. He didn't look at me right away. Of what? Of something, I answered, barely louder than a whisper. He isn't asking, but he's watching more closely. The truth was, my husband had begun lingering longer in doorways. Pausing before speaking. Watching me the way people do when they're trying to catch someone in a lie. I had grown used to being invisible. And now, suddenly, I wasn't. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. We both knew that whatever space we'd carved out for ourselves had started to collapse under the weight of its own secrecy. I spent the afternoon cleaning out the linen closet. Stacking towels, throwing away old sheets, pretending I still had control over something. At one point, I found a photograph wedged between two boxes. It was taken years ago, me and my husband at a friend's anniversary party. We were smiling, arms around each other, our faces younger, rounder, less worn. I stared at it for a long time before slipping it into the drawer and closing it softly. That night, my husband didn't come to bed. He said he had work to do, and I didn't question it. I lay awake again, the silence no longer comforting but sharp. The next morning, he asked if I wanted to go with him to the market. I declined. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been quiet lately." "I've had a lot on my mind," I replied. "Anything you want to talk about?" I shook my head. "No. Not really." He looked at me a second longer than usual, then left without another word. When I turned around, he was there, standing by the doorway, having heard the entire exchange. We didn't say anything. We just looked at each other. Not with longing, not even with guilt, just awareness. The kind of mutual understanding that forms in the spaces between mistakes. Later, I went for a walk alone. I passed the park, the bakery, the same small cafe I used to visit years ago. I didn't go in. I just stood outside and watched the world move around me. I no longer knew what I wanted. Only what I couldn't keep doing. That evening, after my husband had fallen asleep on the couch, I sat outside on the back steps, watching the stars blink slowly into the night. He joined me quietly. Sat beside me, close but not touching. "I think this was always going to happen," I said eventually. He didn't answer. And for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't hurt. It explained everything. We sat like that until the cold crept into our clothes and the sky turned to black. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said goodnight. There was nothing left to say. The weight of everything began to shift subtly, like the way a house settles into the earth after too many years. Nothing collapsed, not outright, but there were sounds in the walls I hadn't noticed before. Groans in the floorboards. Stillness where there had once been softness. The air in the house changed. Even my husband's silence felt different, less like distraction and more like surveillance. He was beginning to notice, even if he didn't know what, exactly, he was looking for. I moved more cautiously through the days. Each interaction was considered, filtered through layers of rehearsed expressions and carefully chosen words. I monitored my voice, made sure it didn't tremble. I kept my eyes on the grocery list or the weather or the news, anything that didn't reflect what had taken root inside me. He, too, had changed. I noticed it in small things. He no longer sat in the kitchen while I cooked. He avoided being alone in rooms where my husband might find us together. He lingered near doorways, his presence quieter, more restrained. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. A line had been crossed, and though we hadn't spoken of it since, we both knew how far we'd gone. I found myself watching him from across the room, from behind the rim of my teacup, from the hallway mirror when he walked past. He rarely looked back. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he couldn't afford to anymore. My husband began asking more questions. Simple ones, on the surface. "How was your day? Did you do anything special? Where did you go this afternoon?" All spoken with a smile, yet there was something behind the tone. Something too even. Too controlled. He never said he suspected anything. He never accused. But his eyes were no longer passive. One evening, during dinner, he paused mid-bite and looked at me. Just looked. "You've been different lately," he said. I kept my voice calm. "How do you mean?" He shrugged, slicing his food. "I don't know. Just quieter. Distant." "I've had a lot on my mind," I replied. "That's all." He didn't press. But he didn't let it go either. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed, legs folded beneath me, the house completely still. He slept beside me, facing away, one hand curled under the pillow. I watched the shape of his back rise and fall, wondering when exactly it had all unraveled. Not the moment of betrayal. That had come later. I meant the earlier moments. The silences that had gone unchallenged. The affection that had withered without notice. Down the hall, I imagined him awake, too. Probably staring at the ceiling, the way I often did. Probably wondering the same things. The next day, I tried to return to the version of myself that once existed. I called an old friend, made lunch plans, laughed at things that didn't feel funny. I told stories that used to be mine but now felt like borrowed clothing. When I returned home, the house was dark. My husband was still at work. He was in the garden, watering the plants as if his life depended on it. I watched him from the window for a long time before stepping outside. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that don't burst but press down on you until you can't breathe. I walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate. He didn't look at me. "We should talk," I said. He nodded, still watching the soil soak in the water. "I know." We sat later on the edge of the porch steps, arms barely brushing. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There was no need to name what had happened. It hung between us, shapeless but undeniable. "I'm leaving in a few days," he said eventually. "Back to school. Semester starts." I nodded. "I figured. It's better this way." "I know." It was the first time we'd spoken of it aloud. The finality of it struck harder than I'd expected. Not because I thought it would last, but because I hadn't imagined what it would feel like to watch it end. When my husband returned later that evening, the three of us ate dinner together again. The same table, the same chairs, the same practiced ritual. But everything was quieter. Even the clinking of the cutlery seemed hesitant. He spoke of an upcoming trip, another client, more meetings. I nodded where appropriate. He didn't look at either of us directly. After he went to bed, I stood in the kitchen, washing the same plate over and over again. He entered behind me. Stood still. "I'm sorry," he said. I didn't turn around. "I know. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." "Neither did I." He stepped closer, not touching me, just close enough for me to feel the heat of him. "I'll go quietly," he said. "I won't make it harder." I finally looked at him then, his face shadowed by the soft overhead light. There was no anger there. No desperation. Just a kind of sad understanding. "Thank you," I whispered. That night, I didn't sleep again. I walked the hallways barefoot, touching the walls like they might remember the parts of me I had forgotten. In the guest room, I paused by the doorway. His suitcase stood open on the floor. Folded shirts. Notebooks. A framed photo he hadn't unpacked until now. I didn't enter. I didn't say goodnight. I simply turned away. In the morning, he would begin to disappear. Not with drama. Not with anger. Just the quiet retreat of someone who had come too close to something he could never keep. And I would be left in the house I had built, still standing, still furnished, but emptied in all the ways that mattered. He left early, just after dawn. I heard the soft thud of his suitcase wheels moving across the hallway, the quiet click of the door as it shut behind him. No goodbye. No last glance. Just the final, inevitable sound of someone stepping out of a story they never truly belonged to. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling as morning light crept across the walls in quiet streaks. The house was still. Too still. There was no movement downstairs, no water running through the pipes, no footsteps pacing the kitchen. Just air and space and the weight of a silence I had helped create. When I finally rose, I moved slowly through the motions of routine. I brushed my hair, made the bed, straightened a pillow that didn't need straightening. I didn't speak. Not to myself, not to the mirror, not to the ghosts lingering in the corners of the hallway. Downstairs, the kitchen was untouched. His mug was gone. The extra chair was pushed neatly back under the table. There were no shoes by the door, no sweater draped over the back of a chair. Only absence. I poured myself coffee and stood at the window, watching the wind shift through the garden. It looked the same as it always had, overgrown in some places, too neat in others, but without him moving through it, it seemed smaller somehow. As if a layer had been peeled away, and now I could see all the spaces where his presence had quietly fit. My husband came down just after 8. He greeted me like he always did, mild, polite, unseeing. He poured himself coffee, asked if I had any plans for the day. I shook my head. Said I might clean the guest room. He didn't respond. He never did when I mentioned cleaning. I waited until he left for the office. Then I went upstairs. The guest room was half lit by morning sun. His scent still lingered faintly in the air, just barely enough to notice. The bed was made. The drawers were empty. The desk was bare. Only a folded piece of paper remained on the pillow. I sat on the edge of the mattress and picked it up. There was no name on the outside. No signature inside. Just 5 words, written in his steady, familiar hand: "You were never invisible to me." I folded it slowly, deliberately, and slipped it into the pocket of my robe. I didn't cry. There was no need to. I stood and opened the window, letting in the breeze. The curtains shifted gently. The air smelled of lavender and dust. Downstairs, I stripped the kitchen of his remaining fingerprints, an extra bowl in the cabinet, a coaster tucked behind the kettle, the faint outline of his name on the whiteboard where we'd once listed groceries. I cleared everything. Not out of anger. Not out of shame. But because the house demanded balance again, even if that balance was hollow. Later that afternoon, I sat at the piano for the first time in months. My fingers hovered above the keys, unsure where to begin. I played a single note. Then another. Nothing recognizable. Just sound. Just proof that something inside me still moved. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband. He turned to me in the dark and touched my shoulder lightly. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No," I said, my voice steady. "Nothing's wrong." And maybe it wasn't a lie. Not exactly. In the days that followed, life resumed its shape. Groceries were bought. Bills were paid. Laundry folded itself into the rhythms of habit. My husband continued his patterns, mornings in meetings, evenings in silence. We spoke more often, but said less. Sometimes, I'd catch him watching me. Not with suspicion. Not even with curiosity. But with distance. As if he, too, had started to wonder who I was now. I didn't tell him. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I no longer needed to explain myself. A week later, I visited a gallery downtown. Alone. I walked through rows of paintings and stood still in front of one, a quiet canvas in muted blues and grays. It showed a woman standing near a window, her back to the viewer, her hands folded. You couldn't see her face, but you could feel everything she wasn't saying. I stared at it for a long time. And when I left, I didn't take a brochure. I didn't need a name for what I'd seen. That evening, I returned home before sunset. The house welcomed me the same way it always had, soft light in the hallway, the smell of dinner drifting from the kitchen. My husband was at the table reading the paper. He looked up, nodded, then went back to reading. I stood for a moment, just inside the door, and thought about how quiet everything had become. And how, somehow, I could finally hear myself in that quiet. Not the woman I had been. Not entirely. But someone new. Someone who had made a choice, lived inside its weight, and stepped back into her life anyway. Not out of guilt. Not for forgiveness. Just because it was time. Because the silence no longer scared me. It was mine now. And I had learned how to live inside it.